I'm Brad Peebler, and on this tape we're going to be talking about ParticleFX. ParticleFX is the tool inside of Lightwave that does particle simulation. We're going to be covering basic particles, collision objects, gravity, wind, all the tools inside of Lightwave that you need to create stunning particle effects. So let's go ahead and get started. There are several things we need to know in terms of setup with ParticleFX before we get started moving them around. So let's go ahead and take a look at some of the options in terms of setup and different effectors. Okay, first of all, we have to know how to add a particle effect. So there are a couple places where we can do that. On the Items tab under Add, you'll find a section called PFX for particle effects. And under there we have emitter, collision, gravity, and wind. These are your basic types of effects that you can add for the particle effectors. So you can go ahead and just drop right here, Add Effector. You can pick a name, and we'll just call this Particles. Say OK. And now we've got an emitter called Particles. Go ahead and clear that out, and I'll show you the other place we can add particles. If we go over to Scene here, this is where we have our entire dynamic set of tools. We have our effects browser, and if we click on that, it brings up a little browser that we can just leave floating. This little non-modal panel, and if you're doing a heavy-duty particle work session, you can just leave this floating so that you can always add whatever you want right from here. Also allows you, after you've added your emitters, to access the properties for those just by clicking on the Properties button. If you have closed this panel, you'll also find the Properties panel button over here under the Scene panel, just underneath the browser. You can click on that. It'll do the same thing. Okay, now you notice we have two types of emitters here. One is called HV emitter, and one is a Partigon emitter. And there's a very subtle but very important difference in these two things. I'm going to add a particle emitter, and now we have two listed, HV emitter and particle emitter, we can see here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to move this one over a little bit, and we'll go to our camera's view, and we'll move our camera over just like this. And let's scroll forward till we have a bunch of particles in each. Okay, so here we can see the particles. Now if I go to make a test render, what you'll see is we only see the particles in the cloud on the right. And that happens to be the Partigon emitter. Okay? Partigon is a contraction. It stands for particles and polygons. So these are particles that are actually made out of tiny little single-point polys. Lightwave has the ability to render single-point polys as dots, so you can add those in there so you can get an immediate look. Now with HV emitter, that stands for hypervoxels. Hypervoxels is our volumetric solids rendering tool that allows fire, smoke, water, that sort of thing to be rendered on top of the particles. Now because smoke is transparent, you don't want to see those little dots in the middle of your hypervoxels, so HV emitters are set to not render at all. So if you want to add a smoky effect or a fire effect with hypervoxels, make sure you add an HV emitter. But don't be surprised if you add an HV emitter when you hit a render. If you haven't applied HV yet or hypervoxels to it, you're not going to see anything. Okay, so those are the two types of emitters. That's very important to be aware of that. One more thing about the partigons. If we go to the Objects Properties panel, under Rendering, you can see down here on the particle line thickness, you can actually set a preset. You can say 1 pixel or 2 pixels or 3 pixels. You'll notice now if I go to 3 pixels, they're much thicker than they were before. Okay? Now if I go ahead and set this up, I can type in a number if I want to. Maybe I want 10 pixels, and then you'll see it generates these big 10 pixel spheres. Actually, they're flat disks. So you can go, there's our 3 pixels, there are 10 pixels. Okay, so if you want to change the size on that, you can do that right there under Rendering on the Objects panel. All right, let's go ahead and remove this one from the scene. And let's take a look at some of the emitter basics. So we're going to go in here, go back to our perspective view here. And again, what we want to do is open up our Properties tab. And this is, again, a nice non-modal panel, so I can just leave this playing here, and I can start to see the particles emitting. Now, there are a couple of key settings out here on the Generator tab. First of all, you've got your birth rate, which tells you how many particles are being emitted. And then there's a Generate By, which tells you that you're running it in particles per second. This means you've got 100 particles per second. If I set that to frame, you'll see it emits a lot of particles very quickly because it's emitting 100 particles per frame. But you'll notice that after a few frames, it stops emitting. The reason for that is right here, the particle limit. Particle limit is set to 1,000, so once it hits frame 10, you've maxed out your 1,000 particle limit. Hence, it stops emitting particles. If I go ahead and push play again here and type in another 0, you'll see it just continues to pile up those particles all the way through the animation. Let's go ahead and set that back down to 1,000, and we'll put this back to seconds. Okay, now you've also got generator size here. This is pretty straightforward. If you want to reduce the size of your generator, you can type in, or you can drag your mini sliders here interactively. Now, another thing you'll notice is the nozzle type. And we're just going to cover the basics right now, which is sphere and box. The outside area of the emitter is always drawn as a box, but you'll see when you have it set to box, the particles actually emit all the way out to the boundaries of that box. Again, it might be a little more apparent if we go ahead and turn it up so you can see it fills in quickly. When we set this to sphere, you'll see it actually emits from a spheroid pattern inside that bounding region. So we go back to particles per second here. Okay. Now the next thing I'm going to talk about are some of the particle motion effects. Let's go ahead and reduce this guy back down to a smaller cube there. Stretch the x-axis out a little bit more. Let's just stretch it out into a nice little bar of particles. And we'll go over here to motion, and you can see straight out we've got the velocity, which is the speed at which they're being emitted, and then the vector. Right now there are no vectors. The particles just emit and sit there. If we start to increase the y vector, you see our particles start to go up on the y-axis. You can also set a negative value, and that'll spread those particles down. You can go back up like this. There you go. If you set it to an x-axis, it's going to move them towards the x. And of course, if you set a z vector, it's going to shoot them back on z or forward on z. So let's go ahead and set this back up here with a nice little 2 on the y. And you'll see we have some settings down here. We've got settings like explosion, vibration, and the threshold settings. Explosion is basically just going to make the particles explode out in all directions. As you can see there, very good for, guess what? Explosions. Vibration, rather than spreading them out in all directions, is just going to vibrate along the vector which they're traveling. So it's not going to be exploding out in all vectors, only along the vector that we're traveling along. We're going to turn that down. Okay, now one of the things that's really important about the particles that you'll notice is after they've emitted, they start to slow down. And in fact, if we turn up the particle duration, you'd see that they actually come to a rest. The reason for that is over here in the particle attributes. You'll notice that under particle resistance here, we've got a setting of 1. That means there's some resistance as they travel through the atmosphere. If we set that down to 0, you see they just keep spraying out up into space. If we set that up to, say, 10, you'll see now it's like they're traveling in a really sticky, viscous liquid. We set that back down to 1, or maybe 2. You'll see they start to slow down. Now, you'll notice beneath the particle resistance is a plus minus. Okay? This is a randomization that adds into your particle resistance value. You'll see that on all the fields here: particle weight, particle size, particle resistance, and the lifetime. If we set this back to 1, and then we set a plus or minus of 1, some of these particles, you can see, have 0 resistance, so they keep traveling. Some of them have a resistance of 2, and they stop in here. And then all the rest have values in between, because it's randomly adding or subtracting some value between 1 and 0 to the initial 1.0 resistance value. So that's a good way to randomize the particle effects. Generally, you don't want to have the same value in your plus or minus field that you do in the initial value, because then it's going to mute out that value when it adds a negative 1. So you might want to say just a slight variation. That gives you a nice little subtle randomization in the effect. Okay, the next thing we want to take a look at is up here under particle weight. And particle weight actually works along with the particle resistance. Okay? The heavier the particle is, the least it's going to be affected by that resistance. So if we set this down to 0, you see it's got no weight at all, so the resistance just holds it right in place. If you set that to 0.5, you see again the resistance is effectively hitting the particles twice as much as it did at 1. And if we set that to 1.5, it's now affecting it about half as much. So that's particle weight. And again, you can add plus minus to that to get nice combinations and variation in the effect. Okay, the next thing we're going to talk about in particle basic options is the lifetime. And right now it's set to frames of 60, which means each particle will last 60 frames before they die. If we go down here and set our last frame of our scene up to a higher number, let's set those up to 120. Now we push play. Let's just go ahead and go back to our generator here, and I'm going to set this up to 50 particles per second, and we're going to set a limit of 50, so we burn through all those particles in the first second. The first ones that are emitted at frame 0 die at frame 60, and then the ones that are emitted all the way up through there, the last particle will die at frame 120. Okay? If you don't want the particles to die, you just set this up to 120, and now they'll live all the way throughout the entire animation. And again, you can see the resistance. They're finally coming to a rest right towards the end of the anim there. Again, you can randomize that, so some of them die and some of them do not. I've got a plus or minus of 60. We could set a plus or minus of 120. And you can see some dying and some living all the way throughout the animation. Okay, the last thing I want to take a look at is a different kind of generator type, which is the cone. So we're going to go ahead and set this to 0, 0, 0. Okay, so now we've got one tiny little emitter here. Actually, what I wanted was 1, 1, 1. So we're back into our basic shape there. And we'll go ahead and set our particle limit back up to 1,000. And let's crank out our birth rate to 100. Okay. Now, you see every once in a while I get this random spray of particles shooting out there. Sometimes when the particle emitter is playing and I'm changing the values, you'll get a random error in the calculation. What you have to do to clear that out is basically to stop this from playing and change the beginning frame. Basically, all you have to do is make it rethink the simulation. And once you've done that, you should clear those out. There we go. Okay, another type of generator, or nozzle, is the cone. Okay, and again, it doesn't look like much has changed here, but what we can do, if we scale this down just a little bit, then we go to motion here. If I change my vibration, you'll see it starts to vibrate out in a cone shape. Okay, and if we look at the top, you'll see the cone particles are spraying out in a constant amount all the way throughout. If I change my vibration minimum, up here you can see on the inside of the cone, and let's just stop it right here. You see on the inside of the cone as I go along, it removes the particles from inside. So that's essentially the inner and outer sections of the cone. The first vibration setting sets the outside value, how big the entire cone is. The second value sets how much of the inside of the cone is covered with particles as well. So if we set this up, you see there's an empty space in here, and the particles are just emitted in this cone radius here. Again, very easy to see that visually once you've got some particles in place, just by scrolling those across there. All right, so that should give you enough information to get your particles moving. Now we want to put some effectors on your particles. The first thing we want to take a look at is gravity. So let's take a look at how we have two different ways to apply gravity to your particles. First of all, you'll notice there's a very quick and easy way to add gravity. If we go to our particle options properties, you'll see that under the etc. tab here, there's a gravity field. And we can just type in, say, -1 here. And now if we push play, you'll see my particles are spewing up out of the cone that we just created and coming right back down. Okay? And again, you can increase the, you can make a positive gravity if you want, which will actually pull the particles up. Or we can make a very large gravity, which pulls them straight down. That's actually Earth gravity right there, -9.8 meters per second. Sometimes this is going to be a little heavier than you want, so you can just kind of tweak with it and get it right to where you want if you want to do a little bit lighter. And this also interacts with the particle's weight. So the more weight you have, obviously, the heavier it's going to be, and the faster it will fall with the gravity. You can create a little bit less weight. Now gravity barely affects it, but you'll notice now, because I turned down the weight, the resistance is really hitting it heavy. So you've got to kind of work with those values all together to get the effect that you're looking for. Now, this is just a general setting for gravity for the particular emitter you're working with. There's a more specific type of gravity that you can work with, which is an actual gravity effector. So I'm going to go ahead and turn off gravity here. Okay. And let's just go ahead and close our emitter properties there. And we'll go ahead and go back to frame 0, and we'll say add a gravity item. Okay, again, I can use the ParticleFX browser here to add that, or I could use my items, add, effects, gravity. Either way, they both work fine. So now you see we have our gravity field here, and let's just move it over a little bit and push play again. Now you can see nothing's happening to my particles. Why is my gravity not affecting it? Well, my gravity right now has a fall-off area, and it's only affecting the particles that are within that range. So if I move this guy over and up like this, now as those particles go out there, you can see they're still being affected. Now the problem is they're moving so fast when it first comes out of the gate, they don't get affected very much. So we can move that up a little bit and make sure we've got that in alignment. Push play again. And now you can see once the particles hit, it starts to blow them up. You can see the arrows are pointing upward, so I've got a positive gravity there. What we want to do is go into the properties here, and you can see on the gravity properties several things. First of all, there's your fall off mode. That tells us it's going to fall off. You've got a radius of 1 meter, that's this little area here, and we've got a vector of 1. So the first thing we want to do is give it a -1, and now you'll see the particles as they blow up. They hit the gravity and they start to come down. Those that miss the gravity keep right on going. So it's actually a sort of a gravity field that's inside that area. Now if you want it to affect the entire scene, you can come up here to your fall-off mode and just set it to off. And now it doesn't matter where you place your gravity. We can move it back over here. But you'll see that the particles are still being affected by it, no matter where you place it in the scene. You can also set an inverse distance, which is going to give you basically a linear fall-off, a little sharper fall-off than the linear one. But we'll set that back to off because we want it to affect the entire scene. So gravity is pretty straightforward. You can also have a size effect here. And what this does is it tells it, as I scale the gravity item, it's going to increase the effect of the gravity. So if we go here and we go to items, size, and we size this down, you see the little, or size it up and down, you see the little lines growing and shrinking? That's changing the strength of the gravity. More gravity, less gravity. So what I could do is I can go here and set it very low. You see the particles are barely being affected by it. And then I'll crank it way up. Create a keyframe for it there. And you see interactively, as I'm increasing the gravity's strength, those particles are falling according to that gravity. So it starts off very little gravity, and then once it gets going, gravity increases. Let's just go ahead and create a key here, and then decrease it again. And let's watch my particles change. My gravity gets heavy, and then turns off again. Heavy, and off. Pretty interesting effect you can create by animating the size of the gravity to change the strength. Now, if we change this to region, rather than changing the scale of the gravity, it's going to change the region. So when it's very large or very small, it'll only affect the particles in this region. As the item scales up, the region gets larger and then scales back down again. So you see once it scaled up really large here, it started affecting these particles in this region, and that turns off and they're unaffected again. So those are your scale choices. And you'll find these modes on most of the different effectors. Like wind will have these same types of mode, and so will the collision items. Okay, let's go ahead and reset that back to gravity. And let's change our fall-off mode again. And let's go ahead and kill our keyframes. We'll select the object here, and we'll just scroll through, delete the keys, and we'll scale this back up to 111. Okay, and there we go. So we're back to our regular gravity. Pretty straightforward there. There is one other setting I want to talk about here, and that is the power. And the power is just another way to manually change the effect of the gravity. And again, this is going to have the same type of effect that it had when I was increasing the scale, but rather than scaling the item, you can just change the power right in here. So if you're not needing to keyframe it, you can just set that directly inside the gravity interface. Now that we've covered basic motion and gravity, let's take a look at some of the effects we can create with wind effectors. Okay, I'm going to come back in here. Let's just remove our gravity effect from the scene. And here we can see our particles. I'm going to go ahead and change the particles here to make them a little bit wider again. And we're going to go ahead and set our generator back to a box. And we're going to turn off our vibration. Okay. And then we need to increase the scale of the item on X and Y, just so we have a nice wide spray of particles here. There we go. Okay, got the nice particles going around there, a nice big field of particles. So the next thing we want to do is add a wind effector. And as we know, we have two methods for adding particle effects. This is going to be wind from the ParticleFX pop-up on the Item Add pop-up menu. And the other one is in the ParticleFX browser, where we can say Add Wind. And either one works equally well. You'll notice the wind effector looks very similar to the gravity effector. So we're going to go ahead and open up the ParticleFX wind. And you can see here, once again, we've got a fall-off mode set to linear. We've got a radius of 1 meter and a power of 100%. So if we just, let's go ahead and come back out here, we'll choose the particles. You can see the particles that are sort of in that wind area come out emitting just a little bit faster. We're going to go ahead and change the fall-off mode to off. And now you can see, if we go back and select our particles, that all the particles are being affected and they're getting a little extra boost from that wind. Now the particles were starting on their y-axis to begin with, and now we've got the wind blowing them straight up, so the effect of the wind gets kind of lost. So let's go ahead and rotate the wind here. So we'll go ahead and grab this guy here and let's rotate it straight over this way. And now you can see as the particles go up, the wind affects them and they go blowing off to the right there. If you want to increase that effect, you just drag your power slider here, and you can see now the wind is blowing those off in this direction. Okay, let's just go ahead and set this back down to 100%. And it gives it a nice directional wind. Now, another thing you'll notice here is under wind mode, we have several different options. Right now it's set to direction, and obviously that means with the wind selected, we can see it's just in that direction mode. The way you point it is the way it works. Pretty straightforward. And in fact, if we go to one of these frames here and rotate it around, you can see as I rotate it, it's actually showing me which direction those particles are going to blow. So if I rotate it all the way around like that, now we can animate that, and you can see particles start off going one way, and the wind changes, and so do they. Pretty cool. Crank up our power so we can see that a little bit more. And you can see there go the particles, and then whoosh, directing over in the other direction. Makes sense because we're set to direction. Let's go ahead and kill those keyframes there. And let's go ahead and reset this back to its basic rotation setting. Now the next wind mode to look at is explosion. And you can most likely tell what it's going to do just by looking at the graphical icon you get for the effector. And again, you can see as the particles come out, they explode in that direction. Again, I've got it set up to 200%, so we'll turn that down a little bit. And if we zoom out here, you can actually see how the particles come out, and then they just explode. Now, one thing you can also do is we can decrease the amount of particle vector. If we go down here to our item, which is the wind, click on property. Now what we can do is turn down the y-axis a little bit. Let's put it down about 25% where it was. And so now they're not blowing out very much, but you see the wind effect really takes over and explodes them out. So you can create some interesting things there. If you've got smoke that you want to come out and curve around something, you can add an explosion wind up there. Let's turn this back up to about a vector of 1 on y. We'll go back up to 2. It's fine. And let's take a look at some of the other types of winds. We have a rotation wind. Guess what it does? It creates a rotation in the particles. This is great for tornadoes. So here goes the rotation. Now you'll notice the rotation of the wind actually works kind of like rotation in Modeler. Depending on where you place that effector, that's the center point of the rotation. So you can see the particles out here actually kind of get sent off tangentially from the vector of the rotation out into space. If I move that guy back into the middle, excuse me, let's move the wind effector back into the middle here. Then we push play. You'll see now they're spinning right around that middle point. And let's go ahead and turn up our frame range. And you can see create a pretty cool effect there. There's your tornado. Okay, the next one is a cylinder explosion. This is similar to the explosion, but rather than being just a straight spheroid explosion, it's in a cylinder shape, so it creates more of an upward and outward vector as opposed to just the outward explosion in all directions. And again, if we select the wind effector, you can see the actual lines as they're drawn out there. Gives you a real good indication of how that's going to affect your particles. Let me go ahead and just change the particle color. They're right now set to default. This is the light blue color. If we go to our scene editor, there's the option here to right-click and set your GL color. And let's change our emitter to white. Should be a little better contrast for you to watch on your television screens or computer monitors, depending on what medium you watch. Okay, so here we have our particles blowing up. And again, you can see our cylinder explosion creates those guys in that outward direction, out and up. Next is turbulence. And you'll notice this just adds a general turbulence to the particles. And you'll notice now the vectors are actually actively being randomized on each frame. So you can see those little guys cranking out there, and you can see how it really affects those particles and creates that turbulent effect on the swirling there. And again, if you crank up the power, you can see it really affecting the particles, and it also changes the look of the emitter. Let's go ahead and turn this back down. Okay, about 100%. And you've got a donut. The donut's very cool. Let's go ahead and change the scene here a little bit so we can use the donut effector. One of the things I have to do is move this up on the y-axis a little bit to get it right off the same axis there. And let's go back to our HV emitter properties. And what I want to do is change the properties for that so that it's a smaller emitter here. Go to the generator, and we'll set it back to 1 by 1. Okay. And now we'll start a hit there. And you'll see the particles now starting to get swirled around a little bit. We go back to our emitter here, and we scale this up, or down rather, so it's right inside there. And let's decrease the velocity of the emitter. And now you can really see the effect of the donut shape. And again, we can increase the, or decrease the scale a little bit, increase it. You see how when they come in, it actually swirls them around in a donut shape. This is great for creating contrails behind jets or swirling effects of dust. And again, if we move this kind of off to the side, instead of being right on target, you see you get a nice, interesting flow of particles there as they get kind of swirled through that donut shape. Next is drag. And this is just going to cause a dragging effect on the particles as it goes through there. Since there's no fall off, it's just affecting all the particles. If we set a linear fall off there and move it over a little bit, it'll just affect the particles inside that region. And you see how it kind of slows these guys down here. Random is going to randomize the particles. Again, you can see those getting randomized in here. It's just randomizing the motion. And move that back inside that area. There we go. And again, sometimes when you're playing with these, it helps just to crank up the power so you can really get a feel for what the effect is doing. And that's randomizing the motion. Vortex is actually going to cause a vortexing effect. And again, you can see the turbine effect that you're getting from the little effectors. You can actually see the directions. Each one of these little guys has its own little wind vortex that's swirling around to create a really nice effect. And if we can move that up a little bit, and you can see it kicking those particles through there. Pretty cool stuff. Sticky wind pretty much does it all. Particles go up, and it causes them to stick in space. Hemisphere is actually another sort of explosion type, but it's only creating it in this hemisphere mode. And then finally is path wind. And we're going to get path wind here in a little bit. This is a little bit more advanced. I want to cover some other things first, but trust me on this one. Path wind, very cool. You're going to dig it. Okay, before we go there, though, let's just go ahead and go back to our properties. And I'm going to show you another thing we can do with our generate by. Okay, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my particle emitter here to be big again, just like this. And I'm going to set my initial motion to 1, and then under generate, I'm going to change my generate by to wind speed. Okay, we'll close that down there now. And let's go ahead and get rid of our particle browser as well. Now you see on our object here for wind, I've got our size effect set to wind. Okay, so what that means is if I set my size of the object to 0 by hitting numeric 0, 0, 0, see that down here in the bottom left-hand corner in our numeric options area. We'll type those in. Now you see our wind effector has shrunk down to nothing. And you notice when I scroll here, I no longer have any particles playing. Okay, they're all gone. Reason being, there's no wind speed. So, change that. We'll go to frame 40 here and create a key. Again, go numeric, and let's just go up to 0.1, 0.1, 0.1. And now you start to see, once we get to there, some particles starting to happen. Okay? And let's go ahead and set this to at frame 60. We'll set it back down to 0, 0, 0. Same way, numeric 0, 0, 0. And we'll just hold that for a while. Create a key there at frame 117 where it's still at 0. And then, let's say at frame 137, we give ourselves a big giant burst of particles, 111. Okay, now let's just go back here. And what you'll see is, as my wind effector scales, some particles start to emit, and then it gets a big burst. Okay, so you can see the emitter starts, stops, starts again, and then a third time gives us that big burst of particles. So again, the particle emitter now is reading the wind speed and only emitting particles when the wind is active. So this is a cool trick for changing the way the particle effector emits based on that wind speed. Now that we've got a firm grasp on the basics of particle gravity, particle wind, and particle basics of motion, let's go ahead and take a look at collision items. Got our same basic scene here. I'm going to go ahead and remove my wind effector from the scene. And for my item properties here, we need to go ahead and set our emitter back up to emit by seconds. So we've got our particles going on there. And what I'm going to do now is actually change these particles so they have no y-axis motion at all. Just going to let them sit there. So again, we go into the Properties panel, Initial Motion, 0. And I'm going to do another neat little trick here. You see how they come sprinkling in? Well, I'm going to set these to emit only 1,000 particles total, or 100 particles total rather, and I want it to do it all at the first frame. So what happens is they emit, and they're there for their entire life cycle, which is only 120 frames. Let's increase that so they're there for the entire animation. And there they are. So now we have 100 particles kind of hanging out for those 240 frames. Let's actually turn that up a little bit. Let's make that 300 particles. And again, we'll make the emit by frame 300 particles per frame. And now it's time to add a collider. So again, we'll go under Browser, Add Collision Effector. And there it is. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to keyframe this guy with the Move tool. Push him right over here. And I'm just going to drag him through the particles. Okay? And you can see, as I drag it, guess what? The particles bounce off. Pretty cool. Let's push that right through there. And you can see as they come through, boom. Collision. Very straightforward. Now the next thing we want to do is go into the properties for that object and take a look at some of the basic options. First of all, you can see it's set to type sphere. You can actually set that to a box, and now it's going to act like a box. And you'll notice as it goes through, it's actually pushing the particles forward along the front of that box. Okay. You can also set this to be a plane, which is just going to be a flat plane. In this case, that's not going to make much sense since it's just a flat plane that's along the y-axis. They're all just locked into it. Object, if you have geometry loaded into the object, you can actually set this to object or object subdivision surface. Now the reason you want to do that, you might have a character or something in a scene and you want it to walk through some water, or you want rain to bounce off the character. You can actually take the geometry itself and apply an effector to that object. I'm going to show you how we can do that right now. Okay, the first thing we want to do is, let's go ahead and set this back to sphere here. And I'm actually going to show you something about this custom object here. If we go to the item properties for that object, you can see it's actually a regular Lightwave object. But under geometry here, custom object, you'll see FX collision. Okay? So if we want to add this to a regular object, what I'm going to do is just go ahead and subtract that object out of there. I'm going to add in, out of our animals directory, our good friend, the cow. And let's go ahead and move this guy down here into the space. Now you notice right now, he's not affecting the particles. That's because at the moment, he is not a collision object. So how do we make him into a collision object? Well, we go to our object properties, and instead of telling it to add the effect, because if we add a new collision object, you see here, it just adds one of these regular null collision types. So what I want to do is go under object properties for the cow, and under custom object, I'll turn on collision. Now you can see this cow is in fact a collider. Now the thing about him is right now he's still set to sphere. So if we just move this out of the way here and move it through, you'll see as we fly through there, he's hitting some particles. And again, I've got it a little too low, so I'll move this up like this. And there he goes, colliding through the particles. But you see he's affecting them in this radius here, in this radial array. So again, if we go to FX property now, we'll set this to object type. And you'll see it's going to take a couple seconds to calculate, because it basically has to go in and look at every single point and polygon in the object and turn it into a collision object. And now you can see, as we move this, it's pushing the particles. Now you'll notice something strange. All the particles are moving away from the object. It's roughly the shape of the object, but it's about a meter away. Well, right here in your properties, you've got a radius level of 1 meter. Let's turn that down to 0. And now you can see, move this out of the way, as the cow slides through, he's hitting the particles. Now you notice only her legs are down far enough, so what we're going to do again is move her back down a little bit and drag it through. You see now, if we just push play, particles come in, object goes through, and hits the particles. It slows down significantly because it's having to calculate inner collision with all these different points on the object. Now the reason you sometimes might want to have a little bit of radius here is if you're using hypervoxels or some other type of shading effect to calculate the surface of the object, you actually want a little bit of separation. Here you can see I set it up to about 100 millimeters, and now you get a really nice looking effect because it gives a little bit of a buffer, just enough buffer to get that through. The problem with having the radius set to 0 is that each particle then has to hit another object perfectly at 0. Okay, no distance between. There's no room for error. So if it misses one of the vertices on the object, it can actually pass through. By increasing that a little bit, you're giving yourself a little bit of a buffer, and you're making it a little easier on ParticleFX to do those calculations. The end result is you get a better looking simulation, but you have to balance that between how far away the particles hit in that buffer. Obviously, when we had it set to 1 meter, particles hitting off way out here didn't make any sense. Setting it to 100 millimeters on this object seems like that works out pretty well. Okay, so this is the option for object collision. It's very nice to have that in there at the expense of a little bit of processing speed, but still we're getting near real-time playback here on this particular simulation, and it's simulating every time we go through. Now other types of effectors we have on here. You've got object subdivision, which I mentioned earlier. If you're using subdivision surface models, you want to set this here so that it knows to take into account the subdivision of the model before it does the particle simulation. Infinite is great if you're going to be using like an infinite plane. If you just want to have a space where things are always going to collide, you don't want to worry about the radius of it, and you can set that to infinite. And then object advanced is a more precise calculation for when you're doing fluid dynamics or even collisions like this. It'll just be a little slower, but it'll make sure you don't get any seepages in between vertices when particles collide with the object. All right, let's go ahead and just turn this back to sphere, and let's get rid of our cow altogether. Okay, so let's go ahead and add another generic collider here. So we go back to our browser, and we're going to say add collision object, give us the properties, and we'll close this out. And again, I'm just going to make that little animation where we move the particle collider right through the middle. Move it like this. Boom. There it goes. Okay, now aside from just having the different shapes, you have different modes. And in this case, we can set it to stick. And you notice now, instead of the particles bouncing off, they actually stick to the surface of the collider. So that's pretty cool. Again, back here to bounce. Cause them to go ricocheting off the surface of the collider. Stick makes them stick. Now, both of these things, you can change the power. You can increase the power here. You see if I change the bounce power, notice once it hits, it really sends them off flying. If I set that over to stick, you see it just creates more of a sticky power, so they're really going to stick to that surface. Again, we can turn that back down to 100%. It can be about the same. If you get the object moving really fast, sometimes with the sticky mode, still you get a little bit of bounce. You can increase the power there, and that'll hold it to the surface a little tighter. Another mode is erase. So as particles go through, as they get hit, they just erase. You can see there. This is really good if you've got particles falling, like rain, onto the ground. When they hit the ground, you can set the ground plane to be erase. So as the particles hit, they'll just disappear as opposed to falling through the ground. Event. This is a collision event. You can actually create a collision event which will then spawn other particles, and we'll get to that later when we're talking about multiple spawners. Scatter. It's going to tell the particles once they get hit that they'll actually scatter out. You need some motion for this on the particles, so what we'll do is we'll go down here to effects property, and we've got the emitter. We'll give a little bit of Y motion there. Let's just put about 0.5 meters per second. And there the particles go. Now you need to add a little bit more strength for this to take effect, so we'll just crank it up a little bit. You see as the collider comes in, it adds a scattering effect to the motion of those particles. You can see as they goes through there, it causes them to scatter. The next type is attractor, and guess what it does? It attracts the particles. So you can see as it goes through there, the particles are attracted to the collider, and there they go following it. Okay, let's go back now to event, and you'll notice when I change this to event, nothing happens. For the event to take place, we actually have to work inside of the particle emitter. So we go to properties here for that guy, and under generator, we're going to say generate by collision event. And you'll see when the particles have a collision with the collider, that's when it starts to emit. Now we've got a limit of 300 particles and a birth rate of 300 particles, so as the first time it hits, it emits all of them. Let's turn that down to 50 particles, and let's turn the limit back up to 1,000. And you can see now, as my collider goes through there, wherever it touches that particle effector, that's where you get particles. This is pretty cool. If we set this down a little bit, make it a little bit smaller, and maybe give it a few more particles per collision. You can create little trails and things like that. So if you've got a boat cruising along the water, you can create rooster tails behind it. It's a pretty cool little effect there. A very common effect that people try to achieve is that of flocking behaviors. So we're going to go ahead and show you how to set up flocking using path wind and simple emitters. Let's take a look. First of all, again, we'll open up our effects browser, and we'll add a hypervoxels emitter, and we'll add one wind. And I like to go ahead and just open up their properties panel immediately, so we'll just have both those open there. Okay, so right now we just have simple wind and some particles, which is going to cause that to go blowing up in the air because, of course, our wind effector is set to direction. So what we're going to do here is set the wind mode to path, and then we're just going to create some keyframes for it. So we'll say our end frame is going to be 240. Just stretch that out there. And then we just start to animate the wind. So let's go ahead and go to, say, frame 60. And need to select our wind item, create a keyframe there, and we start to move it. Now you notice as I move my wind, my particles follow right along. So I'm going to go ahead and create a keyframe at 120, pull those along there. Now you can see the particles stop here at 60 because their life frame is 60. But you can still see as I move it around, they're being affected by the curve of the wind's motion path. So we'll go ahead and create another keyframe at 180. And I'm just going to pull this right by the camera like this. Okay. Now you can see if I push play, the particles are forcing themselves to travel along that path. Okay, so what I'm going to do here is extend the life of the particles. And let's go make the particles last the full 240 frames. And now you can see as we travel along here, if we select the particles are now traveling right along that path. Now I said I wanted to create some flocking, so I want this to be a little pack of bees or flies or whatever it's going to be. So what I'm going to do here is change our generator to generate only 100 particles. Okay, so we've just got 100 little guys there. And now you can see them all packing along. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a little bit of vibration. That's just going to randomize them a little bit so they're not all on the same path. Now another interesting thing you can do is we can set up a parent emitter so we can have some more particles following these guys on a little bit more randomized path. So I'm going to go ahead and decrease the number of particles again here. Let's go ahead and set this to a maximum of 20 particles. And we're going to go ahead and tell it, rather than generating 100 particles per second, I'm going to tell it to generate 2 particles per frame. Okay? That gives a little bit better spread on those particles. Now the next thing we're going to do is go ahead and give them just a little bit of Y motion. Just get them emitting upward a little bit. There we go. And now you can see the particles following along. Okay, now I'm going to go ahead now and add a second emitter that's going to be parented to this one. So we'll go ahead and stop our frames here. Tell it to add emitter here up in our ParticleFX bin. And to do that, we're going to tell the properties panel here again. We're going to open up and go to generator. And what I'm going to do with this one, first of all, is I'm going to change to my schematic view. And I'm going to parent this one to the original emitter just by control clicking in the schematic view. A very quick and easy way to parent. Go back to our perspective view here. And you see the 2 particle emitters there. Now one just sits, they're both being affected by the wind. So I need to change this type of nozzle rather. So we'll go down here and choose parent emitter. So now it's actually going to be emitting from those little particles. And you can see how they're actually now trailing. Each one of these particles in emitter number 1 turns into an emitter from here. But you can see that it's got too much parent motion. In other words, the second emitter's particles are trailing out behind the initial particles, but they're taking on a lot of inertia from those particles. So we'll go over here to etc., turn down the parent motion to 0. Okay, so now you can see that's actually starting to follow along a little bit more nicely. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to change my generator, and we're going to make it 30 particles per second. And we'll go ahead and turn down the scale to 0 just to get it out of our way. It's really not going to make any effect because they're still going to emit from the particles. But you see we start to get these cool trails going on here. So the next thing I'm going to do is go ahead and change my life on those particles to 240 also, so they live throughout the entire duration. You can see now we get these really interesting looking streams following along. Okay, and then we need to add just a little bit of vibration. And we'll just go ahead and push play here while we're doing that. Just a touch of vibration. Okay, now you can see some of the particles get left behind here. And what's happening is they're getting outside of the radius of the wind. So what you can do is you can increase the radius of the wind a little bit to help clean some of that up. And now you'll notice the particles don't get left behind. Occasionally you get some, you can just keep adjusting the wind, but that's fine for now. I'll just leave it like that. And then the next thing I want to do is show you how we can do some really interesting things with rotation. So what I can do here is not only will the particles follow the wind's path, they'll also follow its rotation. So we're just going to go ahead and go back to our wind effector. And let's just go to some of the frames here. And we're just going to rotate this on bank. And just give it a really strange effect here. Rotate it back this way. And then rotate it again this way. And push play, and you can see if we go and select our particles here, a really trippy effect. But you notice they're still following that path as well as they can, and you've got a really interesting looking flocking effect. And again, you can adjust the particles, of course, but you get the idea. It gives you a really good solid control over those particles with the path wind. So what we can do here is I'm going to go into my wind properties again, and under mode here, there's a little pop-up at the very top that says group. I'm going to choose new group, and we're going to type in wind group. Say OK. And now you'll notice that neither one of these effectors is being touched by the wind. So if we want one of these to be affected by the wind and not the gravity, we come over here, select it, open up properties, and choose the group, wind group. And now you can see it's being affected by the wind, while this one is only being affected by the gravity. Now the next thing we can do with groups is we can actually set up a collision event to change groups. And this is a pretty interesting effect. Let's go ahead and clear this out. And we'll go ahead and once again add a couple emitters. We'll add one emitter, one collision item, and some wind. Okay? And we're just going to move the wind over here out of our way. And we're going to move our collision object just off to the side here a little bit. And let's just go ahead and rotate this around. Now we're going to change our collision item to be a planar collider. So we go down here to type, plane, and we'll go ahead and set up our bounce power at about 150%. That'll give us a nice bounce. Now you notice that right now it's sort of got an offset. If we look at from the side here, you can see it's actually about a meter above the ground plane. That's because here in our radius level it's defaulting to 1 meter, so that when you have a box or a ball, you have a nice volume. When we change that to plane, I generally immediately set that down to 0 so that it rests on ground. Now in this case, what I want it to do is I want the particles to emit off on the x-axis and then bounce off the wall. So we need to change this from the floor to a wall by just rotating it like this. Get that about 90 degrees. Very good. And then what we want to do is just grab our particle emitter and go into its properties. And we'll set the size down a little bit. Okay, good. And then we need to add a little bit of x velocity. So what I'll do is give it velocity of x of 1. And you can see that the resistance is a little too much. So I'm going to go ahead and change my resistance here to about 0.35. Okay, and now I'm getting some particles to bounce off the wall there. Let's go ahead and increase the time of the simulation by increasing our end frame, and then set our particles to die after 240 frames. So you can see now the particles are hitting the wall here, and then they're just kind of bouncing back. If I go to my wind here, and we open its properties, and we tell it to blow without fall off, okay, now you can see the wind is affecting the particles before it hits the wall. What I want to happen is I want the particles to hit the wall and then be affected by the wind. Okay, see right now it's changing the course of the particles from the get-go. So what we're going to do is I'm going to go to my wind panel, and I'm going to create a new group, and we'll call this collision wind. It doesn't matter what you call it. You can call it anything. I'll say OK. And now you see these particles are no longer being affected by the wind. Now, logically, you might think you would go to your particles here and just immediately turn that on to collision wind. But again, that's just going to make it affected by the wind immediately. What we need to do is go to the properties of the collider. And at the bottom of the panel here, there's an option that says change and then a group next to it. So we tell it to change, and then we pick that collision wind. You'll see now, after the particles collide with the wall, then they change into the group of the wind, and now they get that y-up vector. A very nice way to change the properties of your particles. You can actually have it bounce off several different colliders, and each collider can change it into a new group to be affected by a different wind, add some turbulence, or a different gravity. Really, the options are limitless. Obviously, there are a lot of other functions inside of ParticleFX, as it is a very robust particle engine. However, we've given you enough that you've got the basics of ParticleFX, so now we can do some projects. Let's go ahead and take a look at how we might create falling snow. First of all, we need some particles. So we go to our FX browser again. We're going to use HV emitter because we're going to make hypervoxels particles. And we're going to open the properties panel. That should do for that. Now what I want to do is go into the camera's view here. So we'll just hit 6 on our keyboard. And let's move the camera up a little bit. So we'll select our camera, just move it up, and then we'll also move our particle emitter up. Now I want snow, so I want it to start from above the camera's perspective. So we'll just put it right up here. I don't want to go too high up there because I do want it to be falling in the field of view. And I know I want it to fill up the entire screen, so I'll widen it out there. And we want it to go back a little further on the z-axis. And let's just go ahead and make it flat on the y-axis because we don't need to have any height. Okay, so if we push play now, what you'll see is some little dots appearing above our head. Not very exciting. So what we need is those particles to fall. And we do that with gravity. Now I could add a gravity emitter, but remember I've got this built-in gravity control right here in the Etc. tab. If I click on that, I can just add in some gravity right there. And you can see the particles starting to fall. Now, one thing you'll notice is our animation is only 60 frames, so the particles don't fall very far. One thing I can do is I can increase that to 120 frames, and now they start to fall a little further. Again, you can see we've got our particle life set to 60 frames, so we need to increase that. I'm just going to go ahead and increase that to 240 frames, even though my animation is only 120 frames, just in case I want to extend it later. This just gives me some freedom there. Now another thing you'll notice is that the particles start off out of frame. And that's fine if we want the animation to be the beginning or first snow to fall, but I actually want the snow to be falling through the entire animation. So to solve that, if we come back over to the Generator tab, there's a tool called Fixed right down here at the bottom. If I turn this on, it's got a fixed start frame. So we're going to go ahead and put our slider frame at 0, and I'm going to set the start frame at negative, say, 90. So now you can see the particles are already 90 frames in to their simulation before we get to our first preview frame. Okay, you can see that's not quite far enough. So let's set that to negative 120. And now you can see they pretty much fill the screen. And now I've got my little particle animation there. And guess what? That 120 frames that is starting early plus the 120 frames of preview equals our lifetime of 240 frames. So it's a good thing I turned that up, because now I've actually started the simulation 120 frames back in negative space, so that I've got that going the whole time. Now you can see these particles kind of fall a little bit too fast. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to go to the particle itself, and we're going to turn the particle weight down a little bit. Okay, so now they've got a little bit more natural looking snow feel to them, but you can also see now they don't quite make it down all the way in those first 120 frames. So again, I'll crank up my lifetime so they don't die too soon on me. And we'll increase the start frame, or decrease it actually, back to 140. That's pretty good. And now you can see my particles falling down out of the sky in that sort of nice snowy motion. Now you notice right now they're all falling straight down, and that might happen if it was a completely still evening, but what we want is sort of a blustery snowstorm. So to do that, we need some wind. Well, pretty straightforward. We know how to add wind. I'm going to go over here and use my Add ParticleFX Wind, and we'll just call this Snowy Wind. We'll say OK. And you can see this is kind of funny. Our wind effector right here is collecting wind on top of it as they're blowing down. It's just blowing the particles straight back up. But it's also only in this one field. What we want to do here is go to our wind properties. And we're going to turn off the fall off. Now it's affecting the entire scene, but now you can see it's just blowing our particles straight up. That's not what we want. We want a little bit of turbulence. So now you can see as the particles come down, you can actually choose the particles. And that's a little bit too fine of a motion. You see how the particles are just making little swimming motions? Okay, they look more like they're just swimming along and not blowing around. So what I'm going to do is I can go over here to my vector of my wind, and I can turn up the turbulence size. Right now it's set to 1 meter. Set that to 5 by 5 by 5. And you see now we've got a much larger effect. What I want to do from there is turn the power down a little bit. Okay? And now you can see the wind kind of blowing those particles along. And again, if we change the particle, you can see the turbulence effector swinging along, causing those particles to blow. Another thing I might want to do is actually change the size effect, leave that on wind scale. So now I can actually go in here and say, choose my wind effector. And we learned how to do this before. We'll start it off at 1. We'll slide forward and say at frame 20. 22 there, we want that to be at 0, so like a numeric 0, 0, 0. Create a key. Then we'll just hold that down there at 0 until about frame 60. Then we'll go to frame 70 and turn it back up to 1. Actually, we'll leave it at about 0.5. And we'll leave it there for the rest of the animation. And now you can see as our particles fall, the wind slows down, then it picks up again. Now the next thing we want to do is actually add the rendering effect to the snow. So this snow is a little heavy right now. I'm going to go down here to the property. I should say a little too dense. I'm going to decrease the snow birth rate to 50 particles per second. And that gives us a nice snowy effect. You see the wind going on there. And so to actually have these render, as I mentioned earlier, we need to do hypervoxels. So we're not going to do an extensive review of hypervoxels, but I will show you how to add a simple effect. Here's our volumetrics button on the effects area under the scene tab. Click on that, and we can say add volumetric hypervoxels filter. Open that boy up, and there we go. Just double clicking on hypervoxels in the field there opens it up. And the next thing I need to do is double-click on the emitter to activate it right here. Okay, you can also just select it and then click on Activate, but double-clicking is a little shortcut. Now one thing I can do very quickly to see the particles is go down on my Hypervoxels panel and click on Show Particles here. And you see it shows me the radius of each particle. Those are some giant snowflakes. So I'm going to go ahead and scale those down a little bit. And those are some pretty good-looking snowflakes. And then what I want to do is actually, let's decrease that a little bit more. A little more. And then I'm going to add a size variation. We'll set that up to about 100%. So now you can see some particles are larger than others, so you get a nice randomized effect there. Now, how is this going to look? Well, we can open Viper and get a look at it. And there you can see is our snowfall. However, if you look closely, you'll notice, let's go ahead and make a little larger preview there for you, so you can see it on screen. You'll notice these are actually little spheres. Hypervoxel's default mode is to create hypervoxel surfaces, which are little spheroids that join together when they touch. What I want is little flat slices, so I'll go to my sprite mode. And then what I need to do is turn up my luminosity, brighten it up a little bit, and now you can see it's drawing in our little snow particles. Okay, so now we've got the shading in, we've got the motion going, and we've got our hypervoxels filled in. That's pretty much all you need to create your hypervoxel snow. Okay, so here you can see our little snowy hypervoxels particle effects combination there. And you can see your particles blowing down, the effect of the wind going on there, and the little sprites in their various sizes giving that kind of soft snowflake look. Now that we've created a nice snowy effect, let's take a look at how we would set up some fireworks. Okay, so from our ParticleFX browser, I'm just going to add our hypervoxels emitter and go to Properties. All right, let's just move these out of the way here. And the first thing I want to do, we go ahead and push play. I like to have it playing when I'm adjusting things just because I can see it real time. We'll set the Y height to 0. And I'm going to create a wide range. This is basically going to be the launch platform for our fireworks. So I'm going to move this over a little bit so we can see them. And each one of these particles is going to become a firework. So this is way too many particles. So the first thing I want to do is draw that down. Let's say maybe 10 frames per second. And you can see them spouting out there. And we need to turn our duration up a little bit. Let's go and set that to 240 frames. And we'll set our particle limit to maybe 30 particles. Okay, so we get 30 little particle rockets. And that's probably too many. Let's go ahead and go with 15. Okay, that gives us our initial burst of fireworks, and then they'll die down. Now, how do we get fireworks to spray out of there? Well, that's what I'm going to show you. First thing we want to do, go to motion, and we need to set a Y velocity. So again, we start to drag that up there. And you can see all of our particles are dead at frame 60. So for right now, let's just go ahead and set our end frame to frame 60 so we can just focus on that little section. Okay, so you can see them shooting up in the air. We want them to shoot towards the camera. So we're going to go ahead and bring in a little bit of Z-axis movement. There we go. Now they're shooting towards the camera. And we'll go up a little higher. And we want them to fall back down a little, so we're going to turn on some negative Y on the gravity. Now we can turn our particle simulation time back up again so we can start to see how these are going. That's pretty good. We want them to go up a little higher than that, so we're going to give them a little bit more Y velocity. And now you can see the fireworks shoot up and they start to drop back down. That's pretty good for our initial arc volley of fireworks. Now, what we want to have happen is a spray of particles to spray out behind each one of those guys. So what we need to do is basically turn each one of those particles into an emitter. And to do that, we need to add a second emitter. Go to Add Item Emitter up here in the particle viewer, particle browser. And you can see this is going to be our second stream of particles. Now what I need to do is start by decreasing the amount of particles this guy emits. Okay. Now the particle size on this particular object doesn't matter, because once we get this set up, each one of these particles is going to get replaced, so they're going to start emitting from a single point. Right now let's leave it like that so we can see the particles as we're working with them. I want to go in here and say, let's decrease the number of particles it emits. Let's say we only want 2 particles per frame. Okay, so you can see it starting to emit. That's a pretty decent amount. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to need to parent this particle emitter to this one. So I'm actually going to use our schematic view here. And you can see here my particles. Here's my particle 1 or particle 2. This is the child. This is the parent. To do that, I click on the child, hold down Control key, click on the parent. Now they're parented. Go back to our perspective here. And nothing has changed so far. We'll go into our particle emitter panel, and we'll change our nozzle type to parent emitter. Okay. Now you can see, as each one of these little blue particles is emitted, a string of particles emits behind it. That's the sequence coming from these particles here. You can see there's our initial lobby spraying up, and then the little particles behind coming in from this emitter. Now you notice right now they sort of string up behind it. That's because they're taking on a lot of the parent's motion. And we can see that here in the Etc. tab. There's an item called Parent Motion. If I turn that to 0, you'll notice what happens is they don't take on any, the particles don't take on any of the parent's motion. They just sit, emit and sit, basically. Okay? Now, if we turn a little bit of parent motion on, it'll just give us just enough to give a little bit of motion. And then what I can do is go to the Motion tab and add some vibration. And now you see the particles start to emit. Again, we can go to our generator here, turn up our number of particles, increase the maximum number to get more spraying, and you can see now we have our very cool little fireworks display. Let's go ahead and zoom in here. Now the nice thing about this is I can go back to my original emitter and I can make changes to that, and the child emitter will follow along. So if I go to my FX properties, for example, I can change the birth rate, can make more of them, change it to making less of them. I can also change the motion. Let's say we want to go back to the motion here and just add some explosion. It sends them off in all different directions. I can even add vibration to the particles that get emitted from the beginning. You see now I've got a massive spray of particles in different directions. I can change my emitter size. You see it's all emitting from that one central area. Let's scale that back out a little bit. Scale it this way. So there's all kinds of things you can do. The cool thing about that is, as we're changing the properties of the one emitter, it's actually changing the animation for the children as well. Alright, the next project we're going to do actually involves the FX linker. The FX linker allows us to take particles and replace each particle in that emitter with an actual Lightwave object. In this case, we're going to replace the Lightwave particles with a leaf object. And then when the particles fall, the objects will take on the motion of each particle, so each leaf gets its own individual particle motion. Let's take a look at how we set that up. First of all, we need to add our emitter. So we'll start here, and again, since we're linking, obviously we don't want a partigon because we don't want those little white dots, so we'll use an HV emitter. And we'll open up our Properties tab, just minimizing the ParticleFX browser. That's a nice thing you can do. Instead of actually closing the panels, you can just minimize them, and then you can re-maximize them to bring them back up. That way, if you're changing tabs up here, you don't have to go back to the scene. You can just go right down here. If you know you're going to be using it, just check it in and check it out. Okay, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set this up at about 3 meters, 0 on the Y, and 3 meters on the Z. So I have a nice flat plane there. And let's just move our camera up a little bit, and we'll move our emitter up. And we're going to make these particles fall down. So again, we need a little bit of gravity. So there go the particles. And those are going to represent the leaves. Again, we need an earlier start frame so that they're already down a little further. So we'll go ahead and set this back here, and we'll start it to say negative 120. And let's go ahead and make our end frame 120. Okay, so now you can see them falling down. Again, you can see our particles are dying a little early. So we'll go ahead and set these up to 240 frame life. And there they go. Now that's way too many. This looks more like our snow. Way too many leaves. So what we're going to do is we're going to go back here and set our particle limit to 100. And if we leave it like that, you'll see that all the particles fall in one big chunk. So we need to change it so that we generate by frame. And we're going to generate 1 particle per frame. And you can see now the particles come falling down. Again, the start frame is a little too early. So we'll go ahead and start those about there. And now we've got our leaves kind of falling down from the sky. Now what we need to do is actually replace each one of these guys with an actual leaf. So we'll go ahead and close our properties there. And now what we want to do is bring in our leaf object. So from within our landscape directory, again, right in our main content, landscape, we have a leaf object. Okay, so we've got the leaf loaded in there. We'll change our grid size back to a reasonable amount. And now what I'm going to do is actually move my camera in a little bit and rotate it up a smidge. And we see there's our leaf object. So what I need to do is link the leaf object to each one of the particles. So when they come falling down, those are replaced by leaves. So to do that, as I mentioned earlier, we need the FX linker. FX linker right here. We open that up, and it's got some good settings here. What I'm going to do is I'm going to ensure my particles are the emitter. This way, if you have multiple emitters in a scene, you would choose the one you wanted to be linking to. And then you choose which object you want to replace each particle with. In this case, we want to use the leaf. Now we're going to go over here and tell it we want some random rotation. So each particle has its own little rotation going on. And on the pre-behavior, we'll just tell it to stay, which means you can actually just have the particles sitting up there waiting to fall. And what we're going to do is come down here, and I've got some random rotation. We go 90, 90, 90 degrees. That's our maximum rotation. Our minimum rotation is 0. That's heading, pitch, and bank. So 0 for heading, 0 for pitch, 0 for bank. 90%, or 90 degrees rather, for heading, pitch, and bank is the maximum rotation. Then we've got some spin. So we're going to put a little maximum spin of 90 degrees on those as well. We say OK. And now it goes through and it links 90 clones, or excuse me, 99 clones, leaves us with 100 objects, all to our 100 particles. We push play, and now you can see our leaves falling down into the screen. OK, it looks pretty cool. Now another thing I'm going to do is check to make sure I've got my plate exact rate turned on. If we turn that off, it'll just play as fast as it can. Gives a little smoother playback. Okay, now what I want to do is I want to add some wind to sort of make this a little bit more turbulent. And another thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my perspective view here. And I'm going to zoom out a little bit. And yeah, I can see my camera's not in there, so I'm going to go ahead and move this forward like this so it's kind of amongst the falling leaves. There we can see them coming down. That's pretty cool. Now what we want to do is actually add a little bit of motion to the overall particles. So to do that, we use our friend wind, maximize our effects browser, add a wind, and there it is. Now if we open the properties, of course by default the wind is just blowing straight up in the air, so guess what's going to happen? Our particle's going to come down, hit the wind, and kind of slow down. First of all, I want to change the mode, fall off mode, to off. And of course that's just going to blow them straight up in the air. You can see here the wind is just blowing them up there. So now we want to change our wind mode to something like turbulence. And now if we go into our camera's view, you can see our particles kind of being affected there. And as we increase that, you can see the wind blowing those particles around. Nice thing is we can change different types of wind to experiment around. Let's try a little bit of vortex. And again, we can crank up our percentage power here. You see the leaves blowing in the wind. The one I actually like is rotation. This one's pretty neat. So go over here to rotation. And get our power set a little high, so it's really cranking on them. So what we're going to do is turn down the power. And what I'll also see is that if we go to our perspective again, it's got an initial vector of y. So we'll turn off our initial vector. So all it does is affect with the rotation without adding any actual vector to the wind. So if we go back to our camera view here, you'll see as we turn up the wind effect, we can get those spinning. Adds just enough of a touch of variance that it gives a nice effect of the leaves blowing in the wind. Now another thing you can do that we didn't touch on earlier, you can actually have multiple effectors and multiple emitters in a scene. So I'm going to come back up here. We're going to add another wind. And this time we'll go to the wind number 2 properties here. And again, we'll turn off that direction. We'll make this one the turbulence wind. And you can see the blend mode is additive. Okay, that means it's going to add to the swirling rotation wind. And then I can set my fall off to none, or off, and then crank up my power. So now we've got rotation wind and some turbulence adding to those falling leaves, giving us a nice fall feeling. I feel like it's autumn again. And here you can see it rendered. We've added a little bit of motion blur just to add to the realism. And again, you get the feeling of the leaves falling through the wind there. Pretty nice effect. The Hypervoxel's rendering engine is a very powerful way to render particles. However, for a beginner, it can be a little complex. What we're going to show you right now is a way that you can take standard presets and very quickly apply them to a fairly simple particle emitter to create a very dramatic result. Let's take a look at how we set that up. Okay, the first thing we want to do is open up our effects browser and once again add the emitter and open up its properties. And what we want for the fire here is we want it to start from a flat plane on the ground. So we'll just turn our y-axis down to 0. And see our particles emitting there. Let's dial that in. And make it a little bit wider on the x. Okay. Now we want these particles to go up in space. So again, go to motion. And we're going to change our y-axis motion. Give a little bit of an up vector. Now you can see the particles still have a bit of a resistance to the atmosphere. And so they slow down. We can fix that by adding a little bit more y, but it's still going to happen. So what we need to do is reduce the resistance. So we go to the particle tab and just drag the resistance down a little bit. Now, a lot of times you might think, oh, I'll just dial that down to 0. Okay, and that way you get no resistance at all. And I'm going to go ahead and leave that there because that's a natural thing to do. But I'm going to show you a little bit why that's going to cause a problem. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to go ahead and add a wind effector because we want to create a little bit of turbulence here to make these kind of random, like fire kind of blowing up in wind there. So we go to wind, on our FX browser, go into the properties. I'm going to go ahead and turn off the fall off mode. Even though it's pretty much encapsulating the particles, I want to make sure that it covers all of them. And since I don't have any other particles in the scene, it's no problem. One other interesting thing about ParticleFX, the panels are non-modal. So if I want to see the particles here but still work with the wind, I can actually select the particles in layout but then have the wind effect panel open. So if I'm working on the wind, even though the particles are selected, it's kind of a handy thing to do. Now what we're going to do is we're going to change the wind mode from direction to vortex. Okay? And now you can see my particles haven't changed at all. What gives? Well, let's go ahead and make sure by selecting the wind effector. You can see there they are. It's clearly working, but it's not doing anything to the particles. Well, this comes back to that problem I told you that would arise by setting our particle resistance all the way down to 0. Of course, if the particles won't be affected by any resistance, they can't be affected by wind. So we have to turn the resistance back up a little bit. And now you can see the more I turn that up, the more they're affected by that wind. Okay? And we can go ahead and turn that up a little bit more. And now you can see this nice kind of blowing fire effect. We can turn up our duration to more like 90 frames. And we'll go ahead and turn our life frame up to 90 as well. And now you can see this nice sort of turbulent fire effect. Another thing we can do, of course, is set a little bit of plus or minus on the life frame. Let's go ahead and do plus or minus 15 frames. And there we go. So that's the motion of my fire. I like that quite a bit. I'm going to go ahead and close these guys up. And the next thing is to activate hypervoxels. So to do that, we can go over to our Scene tab here, and there's a nice button right here under Tools, Hypervoxels. Click on that, and it's opened up. Now, I'm going to just go ahead and do one middle frame here. Let's just move this over so you can see. I'm going to go to a frame where you've got plenty of particles up. And then I'm going to go open up my Viper tool, the Versatile Interactive Preview Renderer. And you can see if I go ahead and activate the HV emitter here, we'll tell it to activate either by clicking on the Activate button or by double-clicking on the name. You'll see that Hypervoxels fills that in. Now, here's something that commonly happens to people. You're looking through your perspective view, you get this all set up the way you like it, then you make a render, and you can see here, it's totally different. Reason being, my camera view is still on the ground, so you can see there, we're only getting the top half. So what we want to do is move this up. So now our camera's got the nice view of the particles. And now we can go back into Hypervoxels, make a render, and there they are. Now you can see right now, they're set to surface type, which skins the particles. I can set that to volume, which is going to make little puffy clouds. Or I can set that to sprite, which is going to draw little slices. Now, Hypervoxels is a pretty complex beast. It allows you to do a lot of different things. What I'm going to show you is how you can quickly and easily apply a preset. So we're just going to go over here to Presets, open that up, and in here I've got my scratch space and I've got all my presets created. Now you'll have some default presets that come with Lightwave. You can use that, or you can of course make your own presets. If I want to turn this into a preset, I just double click on it and it checks into the preset bin. Now you can see down here I've got that as a new preset. Okay, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to double click on this. Okay, now it's telling me loading this preset might change the particle size. Do you want to keep the current particle size? I'm going to go ahead and say yes, because those particles are pretty good size, and we don't know what the preset particle size was. It might be something giant, and that's going to blow out our screen here. I can always adjust it if it's too small once I apply it. So we'll say yes, keep the current particle size. And you can see now, there I've got the flame on my particles. So now let's go ahead and take a look at this animated. What we can do before we actually render the animation, a nice sort of halfway spot, is the OpenGL view. You can see now that we've activated Hypervoxels, they draw their own little GL particles right on top of the ParticleFX particles. So you can see there our little sprites moving. So let's go ahead and render this out and take a look at the animation. Okay, so there it is. You can see the particles moving up, the nice turbulence effect, and then of course Hypervoxels having its own turbulence effect there as well, creating a very nice looking fire. Okay, hopefully you've got a good grasp of ParticleFX now. As you can see, it's a very robust dynamic particle engine. Of course, there's lots of different things you can do with ParticleFX, and I'm sure you'll come up with lots of creative ideas as well. Well, until next time, keep on rendering.